Chapter 16. Soul Cultivation. Oh, it's so hot. What season is it, summer? Ryuga sank to his knees, covered in sweat. It had been a little over 2 weeks since Imelda began to train both students in earnest. During the morning, they would do basic conditioning exercises. During the afternoon, they would practice sparring with Imelda, and after sunset, they would venture into the forest to battle wisps. All things told, this was nothing like Ryuga expected. Of all the movies he'd seen and all the mangas he'd read, being trained by a master seemed like an event that would run someone ragged, constantly being kicked into shape by their overpowered master, overcoming intense training trials. But Imelda simply had them train 3 times a day, 2 hours each session. Even battle with the Sen beasts was supervised. Imelda would step in the moment she felt either student was being overwhelmed. There was one rule he didn't quite understand, which was that neither student could utilize their assimilated spirit particles until today. They were never given a particular reason, and Ryuga never really thought to ask. This is partially because Drake never mentioned it either. In fact, with each return visit to the Soul Sea, Drake was nowhere to be found. As Drake originally explained, Ryuga could only manage to stay in his Soul Sea for a few minutes at max. Furthermore, he could only visit the place once a day at this rate. The task given to him by Drake seemed trivial at first, but Ryuga soon realized that 100,000 spirit particles was actually a massive number just starting out. At their current pace, Ryuga managed to collect just shy of 1,600 spirit particles. This was a little less than 100 a day for the most part, barely 1% in 2 weeks. Ryuga had to admit he was feeling a bit discouraged. The only silver lining is that he'd managed to raise his level at a rate of 1 per day. He couldn't really say that he felt any stronger than before, though.
Summer? What's summer?
Parisia said as she took a seat on the ground under shade of a tree. She stripped down to her undershirt, sweat pouring from her brow and rolling down her neck. It was one of the first times Ryuga actually realized she was a woman. Her curves drew his eyes, and for a moment, he caught himself staring. A moment Parisia seized upon.
Oh? Do you like what you see, stinky human?
She said, getting to her feet as she struck several stylish poses. Ryuga felt his face growing flush, definitely not from the heat, as Parisia grabbed her breasts and began to jiggle them at Ryuga.
Stop that, ninny,
Imelda said as she hopped up and smacked Parisia on the back of the head. The young cat girl immediately fell to the ground and began to roll about in pain.
Break's over. Today, we'll be distributing your accumulated gains from training. Perry, get up and stop acting like a child.
Imelda motioned for both to take a seat before her. As Ryuga sat before his sensei, it finally struck him how lucky he was in more ways than one. Imelda had a striking figure, despite being a little less than 4 feet tall, especially in the chest area. Ample was one way to describe it. For some reason, Ryuga had a difficult time focusing on Imelda's words as his eyes slowly drifted downwards. The day was extremely hot, so both Imelda and Parisia were wearing less than usual. Imelda in particular normally wore an undershirt along with the rest of her outfit. Today it was absent, and Ryuga could do little to fight the magnetic pull of Imelda's massive mountains exerted on his gaze.
Now,
Imelda said, snapping his attention back to her instructions.
The purpose of these last 2 weeks was to help you get a personal feel for which areas you need to improve in when it comes to dealing with Sen beasts. Make no mistake, there are as many different types of Sen beasts as there are Nekoma in the world. But you should have a good idea how to battle and defeat the wisp variety at this point. Base your choices on that, because tonight, for the first time, you'll both be training on your own.
Wait, what? But I'm not ready, Ryuga protested. Parisia, on the other hand, didn't seem bothered at all.
No one's ever ready mentally for unexpected challenges. One thing I can say, though, is that you and Parisia both have the ability to take on an enemy of this level one-on-one. It's like swatting flies at this point with your current ability. The problem will be how you manage to take on dozens at a time. Also, are you satisfied with your current pace, Ryuga? You're not even remotely close to collecting the amount of spirit particles you need. At the Academy, You'll be expected to use your soul seed freely within the first month. This means your only time to collect spirit particles like this will be now, since you'll be busy for the first few weeks.
Ryuga could only sigh. He knew that Imelda's words were true, but he couldn't help but feel afraid. Perhaps some kind of fear had been implanted in his mind due to his first encounter with wisps.
Besides, when you're by yourself, you won't have to worry about Perry stealing all the spirit particles.
Imelda smiled, then nodded solemnly. That is true, but... Ryuga still didn't seem too convinced.
Relax. Starting today, I'll be teaching you martial techniques. With more ways to attack and defend yourself, you should be good. Although this, too, will depend on you.
You're going to teach us martial arts? This is what I've been waiting for, Ryuga said with a broad smile.
Yes and no. As I mentioned before, my elemental affinity is non-elemental. This is the natural state of all Sen users. So natural, in fact, that no one has ever bothered to create a martial style based around it. Lacking an elemental affinity as a Sen warrior is just as rare as being a dragonoid by comparison.
So, there's no martial arts style for you to teach? Ryuga said, feeling a bit disheartened.
I didn't say that. What I practice, I call formless style martial technique. I didn't want to get into complex explanations today, but here it goes.
Imelda took a seat, a signal that she was about to go in-depth with her explanation.
There are two ways to use your Sen abilities as a warrior. The first is what we call mystic category of abilities. Mystics cast spells in order to achieve the desired result. Spells have structure and will produce the same result each time they are cast. The second type is called martial spells. Martial spells use both the body and Sen to create various effects. For example, thrusts to create magical strikes. However, for me, I never needed to learn martial styles, and all of the mystic spells are so easy and commonplace that even normal Nekoma can cast those spells. An example of this is the spell I cast on you to give you the ability to communicate with me, Ryuga. This led me to create my own style of sorts. It is fluid and dynamic to a degree. I shape Sen and guide it. This isn't an approach that people would normally take, as there are some drawbacks to using this method. For example, it requires using more of your mana than if you were to use the other two methods. It also takes much longer to create complex shapes and constructs, and the size matters as well. Normally, it's just not useful in a fight where life and death can be decided in seconds. However, with much practice, I can do things like this.
Imelda stretched out her arm and extended her palm facing outward from her side. Ryuga watched in amazement as dozens of small, translucent squares appeared and traveled outwards like bullets. They struck a nearby tree with such force that the bark twisted and popped as the small, box-shaped constructs hit. Within moments, Imelda had taken down the tree. The sound of the trunk snapping thundered through the air as the tree slammed to the earth.
That's amazing!
Parisia shouted as she nearly knocked Ryuga over in her bid to react to Imelda's display.
Teach me!
Parisia shouted.
The thing is, you have even better techniques at your disposal. There are hundreds, if not thousands, of fire element martial and mystic techniques to learn. When we reach the academy, you'll be exposed to all sorts of things,
Imelda said with a pleasant smile.
In other words, this is a style that's best suited to me. What I can do is analyze your strengths and weaknesses and work with you to develop a formless style that makes you much stronger than you currently are. It will be sufficient until you learn to properly utilize your elemental natures.
Imelda, having finished her explanation, finally got to her feet once more and beckoned for both students to do the same.
Let's get started. Time is of the essence.
Imelda launched into coaching her students once more about the basics of formless martial arts. The more she spoke, the more Ryuga was awestruck by Imelda. He could tell she was extremely knowledgeable, particularly when it came to manipulating mana efficiently and effectively. This became apparent with another demonstration.
As another example of the difference between formless style and mystic casting,
Imelda created a large bubble of Sen energy, about the size of a basketball, and hurled it towards Ryuga. Caught completely off guard, he recoiled in the most uncool way. But the attack popped harmlessly. Parisia laughed her head off, and Imelda couldn't help but giggle herself.
Now, again, watch closely.
Imelda said as she formed another energy bubble of the same size. This time, however, it began to shrink until it was no larger than a die. "I'm ready now," Ryuga shouted, eager for redemption.
Are you now?
Imelda said with a teasing smile as she directed the energy bubble away from her student. Instead, it slowly floated across the clearing to a large tree.
This is taking forever,
Parisia said, notorious for her short attention span. "I could have handled it," Ryuga pouted.
Just look.
Imelda said as the bubble finally touched the tree. There was a loud popping sound, followed by the force of an impact as the tree was blasted into splinters. Imelda smirked after having seen Ryuga's face.
Priceless.
She thought to herself.
When using magic, the steps you take are just as important. The order in which you take action also affects the outcome. In this instance, I created a bubble of Sen energy using my mana. Then I reinforced it by constantly cycling more of my mana into the bubble to make it rigid. Finally, I condensed the bubble as much as I could. The result is as you see here,
Imelda said, pointing to the shattered tree, which was little more than a standing tree stump.
Mystic spells take care of these series of steps by guiding your mana in specific ways automatically, while a formless style requires manual processing. In other words, you have to master various steps in order to be able to efficiently use formless technique. However,
Imelda paused for a moment, taking time to crack her neck before continuing.
When you master all those steps, you can do something like this.
Imelda lifted her right hand high above her head. Almost immediately, Ryuga noticed the flow of mana covering her fist. This mana then expanded upwards and outwards into the shape of a giant paw. Imelda then swatted her hand downward, leaving a large paw-shaped indentation on the ground before them. "Holy shit!" Ryuga said, absolutely floored by Imelda's display of power.
You can praise me. It's okay.
Imelda said with a smirk.
That's amazing, Sensei. What do you call it?
Perry exclaimed, her eyes practically twinkling at the display of skill.
I'm not sure. I just came up with it on the spot. Let's call it cat's paw technique. Would you like to learn it, Perry? It would be perfect for you.
That's so awesome. You can create any structure you want and then just blow things away? Ryuga could also no longer maintain his excitement.
Yes and no. There are rules to using magic, just like anything else. But once you understand those limitations, you can often find ways to defy them.
Formless technique had many, many smaller techniques associated with it. But Imelda began by teaching them two of the most common. Pulling is a technique where one uses their own mana and also pulls mana from the environment in order to prepare for a technique or attack. The other was energy manipulation. Naturally, the larger a mass, the more difficult it is to move it. The same held true for magic, so Imelda had them begin by creating large spheres and moving them around while gradually decreasing the size of the spheres by condensing them. After a half an hour of practice, both Ryuga and Perry had managed to learn the principles behind basic non-elemental magic blasts. They spent the rest of their time learning evasive and defensive techniques, which for the most part resulted in Imelda beating them with various punches, kicks, and attacks. Just 1 hour before sunset, she called off their intense training so they could finally venture into their soul sea once more.
Listen, Ryuga, I realize you're concerned. After all, it's natural to have fears after nearly dying to horribly weak beasts.
Imelda got really quiet, to the point where the air began to feel stale and awkward. This inspired a side-eye from Parisia, who was looking on in the background. Ryuga could see her face twisted with amusement as she taunted him silently.
But if you're that concerned, just remember this. You're at level 14 now. Also, you can use your soul seed to compensate for your weakness or empower your strengths.
But I don't really feel stronger, Ryuga protested, causing Parisia to giggle even more.
And you,
Imelda said, spinning around to face Parisia.
You've been battling these creatures for nearly 2 months now. What's your excuse for bringing him back in such a sorry state? Bruised and bloody.
Her lecture lasted for a good 5 minutes. There was a certain joy to be had from watching Parisia flit her tail like a sad sack, ears twitching solemnly. After Parisia's lecture, and Ryuga's encouragement, it was time to visit their inner selves once again. Drake? Drake? Ryuga shouted as he glanced around. His ego was nowhere to be found. Realizing that he had very little time, he decided to distribute his points as quickly as possible. Can't die if they can't hurt me. All in, defense, baby, Ryuga said as he madly tapped on the word defense over and over again.
I can't leave you alone for 2 minutes.
Behind Ryuga was the sound of sighing and exasperation. Drake, where have you been?
It's tiring to have to come all the way up here so often. I live on the bottom floor, honestly. Also, when you click that button, you invest in all of your defensive qualities. That's not really bad, but you might do better to... never mind. I'm just gonna help you out. But absolutely no more help unless you pass the level 1 test. Drake motioned for Ryuga to get down on his knees, then touched him on the forehead. Ryuga felt a strange sensation, almost like a gentle current of electricity running through his brain. Skill acquired. Drake's scales. The alert popped up before Ryuga's eyes, lingering for a few short seconds before disappearing. What's this? Ryuga seemed a bit puzzled. You'll see. I'm tired. Finish up and go away,
Drake said, folding his arms behind his back as he departed, fading away mysteriously. I wonder what was up with him. Oh well, I wonder how I can use this.
Use the Force, Luke.
Ryuga could hear Drake's voice echoing all around him as he pulled back to his conscious state. Ryuga spent the next 30 minutes trying to figure out how to trigger his skill. Unfortunately, he had no idea what it did or how to activate it. Finally, he got the bright idea of asking Imelda.
A skill? Do you mean a spell?
Imelda seemed confused initially, but after Ryuga explained what happened, she then seemed shocked.
Your ego must really like you. I'm not sure exactly, but it sounds like a passive ability. Many Sen warriors have them. By the sounds of it, perhaps it's a defensive ability. It would definitely be helpful. Now, stop procrastinating, and don't die.
Imelda said as she pushed Ryuga outside of the protection barrier. You're really gonna send me out there alone? What if I do actually die? Ryuga protested.
I'll say a prayer for you,
Imelda said, feigning a solemn mood as she bowed her head and clasped